The Akkadians are part of the lineage of the Semitic, who inhabited the region of northern Syria. The Akkadians arrived in Mesopotamia around 2550 BC. They were probably looking for fertile land to settle. Right at the beginning of their expansion, the Akkadians and Sumerians had some quarrels, followed by a period of peace, which was very fruitful for the Akkadians. They kept their trade alive and an exchange of cultural linguistic relations with the Sumerians, adopting and adapting the style of cuneiform writing. But, unlike the Sumerians, who valued the development of the arts and sciences, the Akkadians were bellicose people and held war in great esteem. The Akkadians were also polytheistic. As time passed, their gods mixed with the Sumerian deities. A good example is the goddess of fertilization Ishtar, who for the Akkadians originated from the goddess Namu, who was the goddess of the seas for the Sumerians. The Akkadians then regarded their kings as deities, or referred to them as envoys of the gods to command their subjects on earth. The Akkadian kings also held the title of supreme priests. The coexistence between Akkadians and Sumerians had reached a point of harmony. Nevertheless, the Sumerians controlled much of the region's trade, which prevented the development of the Akkadian cities. The Sumerians were always surrounded by enemies. There were the enemy kingdoms of the Elamites and the Hurrian, and many other nomadic tribes that kept invading Sumerian lands. Also, the Sumerians had internal wars, with one city-state trying to defeat the other. Then, around 2375 BC, the Sumerian king, Lugal-Zaggisi, unified all Sumerian cities after several battles. Lugal-Zaggisi ruled the Sumerians for about 30 years. During this period, the Sumerians and Akkadians already lived almost as one people, having several members of the nobility of both peoples sharing positions in society. Suddenly, in the Sumerian city of Kish, Sargon emerged, who later became known as Sargon the Great. The origin of Sargon is not clear. The text written in clay at the time is incomplete, and it's also not clear how he managed to ascend to the throne. On the clay plate, the following was written: in Akkadian, Sargon, whose father was a gardener, the cupbearer of Ur-Zababa, became king, the king of Akkadian, who built Akkad. He ruled for 56 years. After taking power over the city of Kish, Sargon declared war against the Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggisi and attacked the city of Uruk, which was conquered after a fierce battle. Lugal-Zaggisi was captured during the battle, and Sargon, as a sign of his superiority and disdain for the enemies, he put a collar around the neck of the defeated king and dragged him to the gates of his city. After that major victory, Sargon and his army kept conquering the other Sumerian cities and territories of the Elamites and Hurrians, creating the first empire in history, the first Mesopotamian empire. Sargon's fame was so vast that he started to be called sovereign of the four corners of the earth, and his empire spread from Syria to the Persian Gulf and even reached the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon was so powerful and influential that he's even mentioned in Babylonian texts. Exalting his deeds, the Babylonians wrote, "Sargon had no rival, no equal. His splendor spread upon the lands." At the same time of Sargon's grandiose achievements, war was a frequent reality for the peoples of Mesopotamia, which generated efforts to improve the military equipment used by the Akkadian soldiers. The Akkadians worshipped lions, had sculptures and paintings of these animals in their temples and palaces, and some records refer that these animals were captured to be used in battles. Sargon died around 2215 BC at about 85 years of age, a very impressive age for the time. Soon after his death, many uprisings took place throughout the empire, and Sargon's offspring failed to maintain power for long. Little by little, the Akkadians were subjugated by the Goths, a tribe of nomads from the Zagros Mountains at the top of the Tigris River. After 2 centuries of existence, the first great empire in history collapsed. Sargon the Great was a powerful figure and inspired the kings of the Middle East for many generations to come. The history of the human race is filled with civilizations and empires, but that wasn't always the case. At the end of the Neolithic period, a great share of people still had a semi-nomadic lifestyle, wandering from one region to another in search of hunting and other food sources. With the dominance of agriculture and the domestication of animals, human beings began to create ever larger settlements, which allowed a considerable spike in population numbers. Around the year 4000 BC, some tribes started to settle in the south of ancient Mesopotamia. a region between Iraq, Iran, and Syria, bathed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These tribes gave birth to what is probably the most important civilization in history, the Sumerians. The Sumerian civilization was fascinating, responsible for most of the breakthroughs during the Bronze Age. The Sumerians were pioneers in the drainage of swamps and irrigation system for crops. They possessed an intricate and properly developed language, which facilitated trade and the exchange of knowledge with other peoples. The Sumerians also stood out for their artistic ability, developing fine crafts and having great skill as artisans, marble and wood sculpting, and creating beautiful bronze sculptures. And perhaps most importantly, they came up with the idea of writing. The Sumerians developed the cuneiform writing, with small, wedge-shaped objects and clay tablets to engrave the symbols. Cuneiform writing was sophisticated for that time. Using it, the Sumerians recorded the important events, even crafting poems and law codes. The texts written by the Sumerians ranged from mathematical calculations to the study of astronomy and medicine. Later, the cuneiform writing was adopted by other peoples such as the Babylonians, Hittites, and Assyrians. The Sumerians are also known for the improvement of tools such as hammers, mattocks, and picks, in addition to bronze weapons with an impressive quality for that period. The Sumerians worshipped many different gods who were called Anunnaki, a group of deities responsible for the creation of humanity. These were associated with natural disasters, such as floods and earthquakes, as a form of punishment to humans for their sins. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were heavenly beings who came to Earth in search of gold, and to facilitate the mining of the precious metal, they gave birth to the human race. The fact that the Sumerians were considered the inventors of astronomy and studied the movement of the planets in the solar system fueled the belief in modern times that the gods Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who visited our world long ago and taught the early peoples how to grow food and build larger cities. The Sumerians founded the cities of Kish, Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Ur, which became important cultural and commercial hubs in the region. But these cities did not belong to a single kingdom. Each had its autonomy as city-states, being ruled by its kings and maintaining its cultural traits. The city of Ur was particularly important among the Sumerian cities as an important center of trade in the region, with several religious temples, such as the famous Great Ziggurat of Ur. The Sumerian kings often maintained peace, but sometimes they fought wars for the domination of new territories. The wealth of the Sumerians began to incite the ambition of other neighboring peoples, such as the Elamites and Amorites, who constantly attacked to plunder the Sumerian cities. These conflicts gave rise to the first written war in history. The war took place in 2700 BC between the Sumerians and the kingdom of the Elamites. The Sumerian king of the city of Kish was called Enme-Baragesi. He led a Sumerian contingent against the kingdom of the Elamites. Back then, combat tactics could already make all the difference between victory or defeat. The Sumerians had trained and relatively disciplined soldiers who fought in shield wall formations when needed. Probably the most fearsome weapon of the time was the war chariots, with 2 axles and pulled by 4 animals, horses, or donkeys. It is easy to imagine that the number of casualties was high during these battles. There was little protection, and the combat was fought in close proximity. Also, there were carriages with units shooting darts, spears, and trying to run over the less fortunate soldiers. The Sumerians won the battle and recorded on a clay tablet, "We continue to plunder the weapons of the Elamites." Over time, other peoples of Mesopotamia developed large cities and increasingly bigger and well-trained armies. The Sumerian civilization did not resist the military advance of several kingdoms and ended up succumbing. It is believed that climate change also caused a major drought in the region, which contributed to the decline and disappearance of the Sumerian culture. Albeit their tragic end, the Sumerians played a key role in the cultural and social development of the peoples of Mesopotamia. These new kingdoms made good use of the Sumerian legacy, and thanks to their heritage, their names will be forever in history. On the edge of the Aegean Sea, there is a large island. It was named Crete and was home to one of the most incredible and developed civilizations of the Bronze Age. This civilization almost remained forgotten in history, and its discovery was the consequence of major efforts of Arthur Evans. Arthur John Evans was an English archaeologist. He inherited his father's fortune, who was also an archaeologist. He traveled to Greece to study the rubble of the city of Mycenae. In his studies, he found evidence of an unknown civilization at the time, which led him to different places in Greece in search of answers. Finally, Arthur reached the island of Crete, where, guided by stories of the population, found the site of the legendary palace of Knossos, which belonged to King Minos of the legend of the Minotaur. The excavations of the site yielded discoveries that would make Arthur dedicate his entire life to his research. Arthur Evans called the people he discovered Minoans. It was named after King Minos, who, according to Greek myth, was the son of Zeus. The Minoans likely arrived in Crete from Anatolia, where Turkey is today. That migration also occurred in the Middle Paleolithic period, in 128,000 BC. However, the Minoan culture only started to develop after having mastered agriculture, which occurred around 5000 BC. As the Bronze Age advanced, the Minoans began to develop a culture based on sea trading, using their incredibly advanced ships for the first time. The Minoan vessels were elegant and robust. They could carry food and goods. Thanks to their ability to sail for days at sea, the Minoans began to trade with people from Anatolia, Phoenicia, Greece, Egypt, and Africa. Its culture soon began to flourish in many ways. Since the island of Crete offered natural protection, it did not endure invasions from other peoples for centuries. Around 2000 BC, the biggest source of income for the Minoans was agriculture. They produced olive oil, wines, and ceramic items with beautiful paintings. Minoan art highlighted all the sophistication of those people. Their paintings had a unique style and exhibited a deeply advanced artistic level. The beauty of women was exalted in several depictions, with large, dark, and wavy hair, colorful dresses, and lip and eye makeup. Men were usually depicted with dark skin, athletic bodies, and defiant posture. The Minoans also produced gold and silver jewelry, even pieces made of crystal. Although they did not have a war-oriented society, the Minoans used warriors to protect palaces and ships, to fight pirates and possible invaders. The Minoans were deeply attached to physical and athletic development. They had sports competitions like swimming, boxing, and racing. The most impressive sport was perhaps dancing around and jumping over an angry bull. This practice is called tarokathapsia and consisted of grabbing the horns of the bull during its attack. When the bull shook its head up in an attempt to free himself, the athlete took advantage of the impulse to make acrobatic jumps over the animal. To the Minoans, the bulls were sacred creatures, constantly exalted in sculptures and paintings. The religion of the Minoans appeared to be matriarchal, with the figure of a goddess holding two serpents as the supreme divinity. During the excavations of Arthur Evans, clay slabs were discovered with unknown writing, a large part of which cannot be translated to this day. To Arthur's surprise, and all those involved in the excavations, the palace of Knossos was much bigger than expected. Knossos Palace has over 700,000 square meters, 3 times larger than Buckingham Palace in England. The excavations discovered the possible throne of King Minos, the oldest in all of Europe. The oldest paved road in Europe was also discovered. It was located at the entrance of the city, divided into streets surrounding the houses and temples. Some parts of the city had a water drainage system, which worked as a sewer. And something surprising was found below the palace, a labyrinth. This labyrinth contained several massive jars, used to store grain and wine. Some parts seem to have been used as a dungeon for prisoners. Designs of mazes and the Minotaur were also engraved on their coins, emphasizing the odd legend about this monstrous creature. The island of Crete is in a seismic region. To this day, there are earthquakes and strong sea waves. Around 1750 BC, there was an earthquake in Crete that destroyed much of the Minoan buildings. The Minoans remained on the island and rebuilt their palaces and houses. Historians Herodotus and Thucydides claim that the Minoans became lords of the Aegean Sea, ending piracy in the region. They colonized other islands near Crete. Thucydides tells that King Minos sent his sons to rule these islands. By the middle of 1700 BC, the Minoans were already a famous and respected people. Even the kingdoms that arose in Greece, such as Mycenae and Athens, recognized the independence of the Minoans. Crete had become a must-see stop for countless boats coming from many regions. Merchant boats from Egypt were selling their products in Crete. From there, these products were taken to Greece and Anatolia. The same happened with products from other regions. In Minoan society, the imbalance between rich and poor was not clear. The people were always depicted working together. Women were also portrayed as an important part of the kingdom and not just wives or daughters, as in other cultures of the same period. But what does the history of the Minoan civilization have to do with the legendary Atlantis? Atlantis appeared in a story written by Plato between 428 to 347 BC. Plato found inspiration in something that happened 1,000 years before his time. During Plato's period, the Minoans were already part of ancient stories. Due to this, and because it was based on exaggerated tales, Plato imagined and described an ancient kingdom more advanced and powerful than the kingdoms of his own time. But not everything was a product of Plato's imagination. The Minoans were indeed advanced and ingenious people. There were many theories of where Atlantis would be. Most likely, it was the Minoan city on the island of Santorini. The island of Santorini was one of the most important for Minoan trade. There was a huge volcano on it. When the volcano erupted, it almost completely destroyed the island and its buildings. A large part of the island sank into the sea, dragging everything with it, which greatly affected the Minoan trade with northern kingdoms. As if that were not enough, a huge cataclysm occurred shortly after. A strong earthquake, followed by a tsunami with waves of up to 20 meters, affected all of Greece, and especially the island of Crete. The devastation was much greater than that caused by an atomic bomb. The houses and palaces were yet again destroyed. With such seismic activity, the volcano of the island of Santorini erupted again. Despite the distance, its ashes invaded the island of Crete, blocking the sunlight and generating a toxic mist that killed crops and animals, and famine brought revolts and violence throughout Crete. It reached a point of despair, and there were reports that the Minoans resorted to cannibalism. Unfortunately for the Minoans, not even they could fight against the forces of nature. One of the most advanced societies of their time fell into savagery. A disaster of such proportions served as inspiration for Plato to create his story about Atlantis. There probably never was the city of Atlantis, which is a myth. The Minoan people were brave and still attempted to rebuild their cities, but the economy was already feeble and the Minoan kingdom was losing its wealth while other kingdoms were growing. The Greek kingdom of Mycenae kept conquering almost all of Greece, already moving towards the Aegean islands. It is unclear whether Mycenae took Crete by force or offered help in exchange for giving up the territory. The fact is that Minoans and Mycenaeans merged their cultures. 2 centuries later, started to recover the island of Crete. According to Homer, in his epic poem about the Trojan War, the Mycenaean ships commanded by King Agamemnon set sail for Troy from the island of Crete. In 1200 BC, the Mycenaean Empire went into decline, largely due to pirate attacks that destroyed everything in their path. Even the mighty Egypt suffered great losses against the Aegean Sea pirates. The last inhabitants of Crete abandoned their cities and took refuge for over a century in the mountains of the island. This allowed other peoples from Greece to occupy the ancient Minoan cities. no longer able to withstand invaders. One of the most splendid cultures of the ancient world came to an end. The Minoans are considered to be the first European civilization. Their influence was enormous for the Greek people who appeared afterward. Due to them as well, the trading and relationships of many civilizations became possible in the Bronze Age. Great civilizations do not disappear overnight, as in the legend of Atlantis, but their stories can be as incredible and rich as those imagined by the best writers. The Age of Bronze was marked by the rise of great civilizations responsible for the development of new technologies and breakthroughs for humanity. Some ancient peoples, like the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, stood out for their contribution to the improvement of agriculture and architecture. Other peoples, like the Phoenicians and Minoans, developed new forms of art, commerce, and writing. But there were also warlike civilizations which became prominent in the art of war, like the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans formed the first advanced civilization in continental Greece, with a well-organized system of city-states, urban organization, works of art, and writing system. According to DNA analyses, the Mycenaeans were part of the same group of tribes that migrated to Greece in the Middle Paleolithic period. These tribes spread to the islands and the region of the Peloponnese, originating the first Greek settlements. On the island of Crete, for example, one of these tribes founded the kingdom of the Minoans, which was Plato's inspiration for creating the legend of Atlantis. The famous Greek poet Homer used different names to refer to these tribes in his famous epic poem entitled Iliad. According to Homer, the tribes that stood out the most in that period of Greek history were the Achaeans, the Danaans, and the Argives. Over time, with the dominance of agriculture, commerce, and bronze metallurgy, these tribes founded the first city-states of Greece. The largest and richest of those Greek cities was Mycenae, whose name was the basis for naming an entire civilization. The city of Mycenae was found in 1876 by the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich used Homer's account as the basis for his investigations. To the surprise of many scholars of the time, the accounts were right. In his poems Iliad and Odyssey, Homer described the land where Mycenae and other cities were built and the surrounding landscape. With these descriptions, Heinrich and his team discovered the sites where the ruins of the cities of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Troy were located. Around 1750 BC, the Mycenaeans and Minoans of the island of Crete created a busy line of trade between their main cities. Trade between the two kingdoms added new influences to the Mycenaeans, who began to copy the Minoan style of art and writing. For this reason, the historical period is known as the Creto-Mycenaean period. However, unlike the Minoans, who had a culture focused on commerce and navigation, the Mycenaeans were openly a warlike society. Little is known about the beginning of the Mycenaean civilization, but legend has it that the founder of Mycenae was the hero Perseus, half-brother of Hercules, famous for killing the Gorgon Medusa. There are indications that in 1500 BC, Mycenae was already a well-structured city, with strong walls in all of its extension. The excavations in Mycenae revealed much important evidence for the understanding of Mycenaean society. The Mycenaeans buried their kings in secret tombs known as tholos, which were excavated inside natural hills. In all, 9 tombs were found. A large part of them was intact, and many objects could be rescued for study and taken to museums. A curious and unusual fact is that the Brazilian Emperor Pedro II traveled to Greece to visit the excavations. He was invited by Heinrich Schliemann for a lunch organized inside one of these tombs. In 1350 BC, the walls of Mycenae and some nearby cities were rebuilt to house the rapid growth of the population. The stones used to build the new walls were so big and heavy that the walls became famous for being built by a giant cyclops. Many myths and fantastic stories of ancient Greece happened during the Mycenaean period. Heroes and demigods such as Perseus, Hercules, Theseus, Odysseus, Achilles, and many others were part of the Mycenaean world. Many Greeks of the classical period looked to their Mycenaean ancestors as a people closer to the divine lineage and capable of great deeds and achievements. Although they lived in Greece, the Mycenaeans were vastly different from the traditional image we have of the ancient Greeks. Their clothes, architecture, weapons, and armor were more rustic and robust. Many times they valued a more aggressive appearance. The Mycenaeans used many weapons made of bronze, including spears and axes with threatening shapes. Their swords were incredibly well made, and the most beautiful had engravings and handles made of gold. The shields used by Mycenaeans were large and heavy. Some were fully coated in bronze. The warriors' armors were the main highlight, with a great variety of shapes, sizes, and colors. Their helmets were meant to express the courage and strength of the warriors. They were adorned with horsehair and horns. They also used animal skins, such as bovine leather, for their shields, and feline skins, such as lions and leopards, to complement their armor. The Mycenaeans had the best armors of their time. Some covered almost the entire body, being made with large bronze plates that made them quite heavy. To fight while wearing these armors, the warriors had to truly be strong. The Mycenaeans also made recurrent use of war chariots, spreading terror on the battlefields when they tried to run over their enemies. In Mycenaean society, the king was the military and political commander. The people were divided between free workers and slaves. The Mycenaeans produced and exported wheat, oil, wine, ceramics, and bronze, using gold to create jewelry and decorative pieces. Among the pieces produced in gold are the famous funeral masks, made to cover the faces of the deceased and preserve their image. The variety of products produced by Mycenaeans allowed them to develop a great sea trade route. Mycenaean objects were discovered in Syria, Egypt, Cyprus, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. As time went by, the Mycenaeans replaced the elegant style of the boats used by the Minoans and began to create stronger ships focused on combat. Little is known about the original religion of the Mycenaeans, but they created the basis of Greek mythology as we know it. The main deity of the Mycenaeans was Poseidon. At the time, he was considered the god of the seas, land, and earthquakes. Around the year 1370 BC, several earthquakes occurred in Greece and nearby regions. The earthquakes caused so much destruction that the island of Crete was devastated. The Mycenaeans took the opportunity to claim the right to rule the island, considering that it was an important commercial port in the Aegean Sea. In the following 2 centuries, the Mycenaeans incorporated the Minoans into their culture, further expanding the influence of the Greek kingdoms. The most famous of the Mycenaean kings was Agamemnon, who reigned in Mycenae. His brother Menelaus reigned in the young city of Sparta. Both kings married Spartan princesses. Agamemnon married Clytemnestra, and Menelaus married a woman who would leave her name in history, Helen. Agamemnon spared no effort to expand the maritime trade routes with other kingdoms and empires. This caused Mycenaean ships to travel to ports in increasingly distant and exotic cities. One of these cities was in a privileged geographic location. Troy was to the west of Anatolia, where today is Turkey, more precisely in a region called Hisarlik. As there are strong winds in the region that constantly change the tides, many boats needed to slow down their pace or even find refuge in some pier for several days, waiting for the calm of the sea. Taking advantage of this situation, Troy collected taxes from the boats and goods that passed through its territory. Many of these goods were sold in the city itself. If the merchant refused to pay, his goods, boats, and all his money were confiscated by the Trojans. But who were the Trojans? We know little about Troy and its inhabitants. It is believed that they were a part of people known as Dardani, or at least they built their culture together with them. We know that the city of Troy welcomed travelers from different regions. For this reason, Trojans had various styles of clothing, jewelry, and military equipment. One of the few documents of antiquity that quotes the Trojans was written by the Hittites, who referred to them as Wilusa. Troy remained an unknown entity for a long time. It was first found by Frank Calvert in 1863. In 1870, Heinrich Schliemann led the excavations of the city. To his surprise, there was not only one Troy, but 9 cities, one built above the other. Heinrich's excavations reveal that Troy had been invaded, plundered, and destroyed countless times over the centuries. The city was rebuilt several times over the rubble of the previous incarnation. At the time of the Trojan War, the city was already in its sixth phase. According to Homer, it had strong walls and divided into 2 or 3 sections, which made the city an exceedingly difficult fortress to be torn down. The taxes charged by Troy were considered abusive by other kingdoms. This generated conflicts between kings and traders. In particular, the Mycenaeans were quite displeased, for they were a kingdom of proud warriors who considered the Trojans disrespectful. Troy was ruled by King Priam, who sent his son Paris on a diplomatic mission to Sparta to try to appease the situation with the Mycenaeans. Paris was marveled by Queen Helen, wife of King Menelaus. There are 2 versions of the story of Paris and Helen. One says that Helen was kidnapped by Paris. Another says that she would have left of her own free will with the young prince. King Menelaus was furious at the offense and asked his brother Agamemnon, who had the largest army in Greece, for help. Agamemnon identified the perfect opportunity to declare war on Troy and end this abusive tax collection. Agamemnon gathered his army and assembled a fleet of ships. According to Homer, the impressive array had more than 1,000 warships. King Agamemnon also called the legendary heroes Achilles and his group of warriors known as the Myrmidons. The Mycenaean army sailed the Aegean Sea and surrounded Troy, starting a war that would last almost 10 years. The Mycenaeans launched several attacks against the city, but all failed. In one of these attacks, Patroclus, a friend and lover of Achilles, was killed by Prince Hector of Troy. To avenge Patroclus' death, Achilles challenged Hector to one of the most famous duels in history. Homer describes an epic struggle. 2 of the greatest champions of his time fought to the death, near the gates of the city of Troy. Finally, Achilles delivered the fatal blow and killed Hector. Achilles, still furious at his friend's death, tied the feet of Hector's corpse to his chariot and made 3 laps around the perimeter of the city, dragging his body on the stony ground before all the Trojans. After this, the morale of the Trojans was extremely low, but even so, they did not surrender the city. Then the Mycenaeans conceived the plan of the famous Trojan horse. Using the wood of some of their ships, they built a great wooden horse and took it to the Trojan gates, where they put it as a gift for the Trojans, who had great esteem for horses. The Mycenaeans returned to their ships and faked their retreat. The Trojans, relieved to have escaped the siege, opened the gates and brought the wooden horse into the city and started a big party to celebrate the victory. Later at night, practically everyone in the city was plunged into an alcoholic sleep. At that moment, a hidden door in the belly of the wooden horse was opened. Out of it came Achilles and his warriors. The invaders easily killed the sleepy guards and opened the gates of Troy. The Mycenaean army, hiding behind some hills, finally managed to enter the city. The city was looted and burned. Practically all men were killed, including King Priam. The women and children were enslaved. According to the legend, Achilles died in Troy, wounded by a poisoned arrow that hit its heel, shot by the cowardly Paris. Other versions say that Achilles survived and headed to new battle and novels. The sordid Paris was killed that night. The Mycenaeans returned victorious to Greece, but many were punished by the gods and could never go home. King Menelaus took Helen back to Sparta, but after Menelaus' death, Helen was expelled from the city, having died alone in exile. One of the few survivors of the Trojans was the warrior Aeneas. According to the ancient Romans, he fled to Italy and gave birth to the Roman lineage. Much of this narrative comes from the poems of Homer. Although the works include gods, they are not entirely fictional. The evidence points to a real war in that region, and Troy was looted and burned. The texts written by the Hittites say that a people came from the sea and attacked the city of Troy. The texts of the Hittites also mention a Trojan prince named Alexandros, who may have been Paris or served as inspiration for him. Another possibility is that there are a new wave of seismic activities in 1300 BC, causing the decline of many civilizations. The siege of Troy will have happened in that period, and historians believe that part of the city wall fell due to an earthquake. The Mycenaeans camped outside the city did not suffer much damage and took advantage of the chaos to invade Troy. Coincidence or not, the god of the Mycenaeans was Poseidon, who was also the god of earthquakes. As such, from the point of view of the Mycenaeans, Poseidon helped them conquer Troy. The Trojan War told by Homer is a fantastic saga. Completely true or not, it traveled throughout the centuries, and to this day we use expressions "beware Greeks bearing gifts" or "Achilles' heel." Still, because of these earthquakes, many people migrated from one region to another, and many kingdoms completely failed. All these series of natural disasters, wars, and migrations caused the collapse of the Bronze Age. And, in Greece, a warrior people known as Dorians left Macedonia to conquer the cities of the Mycenaeans. The Dorians had equipment and weapons made of iron, which was an enormous advantage over the Mycenaeans, who still used bronze. After the fall of the Mycenaean kingdom, Greece entered a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, of which little is known. Slowly, it gave rise to classical Greece, making the Mycenaean civilization an important link in Western history. Many empires emerged during the Bronze Age. Some became famous as the Babylonians. Others, however, were buried by the sands of time and were almost forgotten in the course of history. The Hittite Empire was one of the most powerful and influential of its time, and yet it remained concealed for a long time. The Hittites were an Indo-European people who, in 2000 BC, settled in central Anatolia, where Turkey is today. They called themselves Hatti, and as soon as they arrived in the region, they dominated the other tribes. This domination was enforced. Diplomacy was only used when feasible. The Hittites were proud of their warrior society and had great esteem for horses. Those responsible for breeding and training horses had a prominent place in society. One of the first accounts of the Hittites is in the Greek tale The Odyssey, where the Hittites are called Ketas. In the Bible, the Hittites are quoted in the Old Testament as Heth. There is even the story of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, who served King David. Uriah and Bathsheba were Hittites. The Hittites are also mentioned in Asian and Egyptian texts. Even with so many accounts, the Hittite people were only officially discovered in 1880 by archaeologist Archibald Henry Sayce. Even though he found evidence, Archibald was a laughingstock within academic society, who said he was trying to make up the existence of the Hittites. Its discovery was only confirmed years later in excavations carried out by the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler. By 1650 BC, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and the Hittite Empire had been consolidated. The Hittites were in a very privileged geographical position, since they could trade with different nations of different cultures. Merchant vessels from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia passed through the ports of the Hittite cities. Even though they were surrounded by powerful kingdoms and empires, the Hittites were never conquered, and it is said they never lost a battle. In 1274 BC, the Hittites fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Egyptians. Both fought fiercely without gaining a decisive advantage. The battle ended in a draw, and the powerful Egyptians were forced to retreat. Pharaoh Ramses II signed a peace treaty with the Hittites, recognizing the Hittite Empire as being of equal military power to Egypt. On several occasions, the Hittites stopped Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek invasions, and even completely defeated the enemy troops. Their equipment consisted of bronze helmets and weapons, as well as heavy armor made of small bronze plates. The Hittites are also known as the first civilization to dominate iron metallurgy. The Hittites also had the reputation of owning the best war chariots of their time. They could carry 3 warriors and were pulled by 2 or even 4 horses. The tactic used by these carriages was efficient. There was a driver for the horses, a warrior with a long spear and heavy armor. Also, a third warrior carried a shield to protect the other 2. Sometimes, this third warrior used bow and arrows for attacks at a distance. A combination of speed, attack, and defense undoubtedly made the Hittites fearsome. Some records mention that even the famous city of Troy paid tributes to the Hittites. The Hittite society was incredibly advanced. They had their own hieroglyphic writing, later changed to the cuneiform writing copied from the Assyrians. They had a very detailed art style, as well as established and severe laws that punished with death crimes like murder. The The capital city of the empire was Hattusa, whose ruins still exist today. In politics, there was the king, who showed social and military skills. Also, there was a council of noblemen called Penkus, which prosecuted the crimes or decided on minor day-to-day matters. Among the Hittites, even the slaves had rights in society. In religious matters, the Hittites were incredibly tolerant. They worshipped gods of various peoples and even respected the beliefs of their enemies, which earned the Hittites the epithet of people of the thousand gods. At its peak, the Hittite Empire extended from Turkey to a part of Lebanon and Syria. Shortly after the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittite Empire entered into eternal conflicts, and other peoples took advantage of this instability. The Hittites were destroying their cities and villages in the civil war. The Assyrians kept increasing the pressure with their attacks. The Hittite population began to flee from their homes and migrated to other regions. After burning Hattusa, their capital, the Hittites became easy targets for groups of pirates and looters. One of the most developed Bronze Age empires ended in ruins. As for the survivors of the Hittites, it is not clear where they went. Probably they lived in small tribes or sought refuge in cities of other kingdoms. Although so much time has passed, the Hittite Empire is still barely known and deserves to be remembered for its great historical importance. Much is said about the importance of Greek culture and how it has served as a basis for the development of Western thought, but the Greeks were influenced by others, ancient and exotic peoples, who are still a mystery to this day. The Phoenicians are among the most developed and influential peoples of antiquity. Their culture had a great impact on subsequent civilizations. The Phoenicians inhabited the coastal region of ancient Canaan, today the maritime coast of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. In ancient times, they were known as the Purple People. The term Phoenicians comes from the Greek phonikes, which can mean crimson or purple, a color considered quite luxurious at the time. Around 1200 BC, Egypt lost some territories due to popular uprisings. The Phoenician culture started to flourish during that period. The power vacuum in the region allowed the Phoenicians to build their own trade routes and fortify their armies. Like the Sumerians and Greeks, the Phoenicians had many city-states. These remained independent with distinct cultural traits. With the development of a culture based on maritime trade, the Phoenicians came into contact with many different peoples, such as the Minoans of the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans in Greece. With the expansion of their domains, the Phoenicians colonized new territories. They founded important cities, among which Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut. One of the greatest contributions of the Phoenicians is related to writing. They created a model alphabet that is considered the ancestor of all modern ones. This alphabet is called the Phoenician phonetic alphabet. It reached Greece through the island of Crete. The Greeks, in turn, added the vowels to the Phoenician alphabet, creating the Greek alphabet. The Phoenicians thrived with the trade of wood, slaves, and glass, but their most valuable product was the Tyrian purple. The Tyrian purple is a natural dye extracted from sea snails. This dye is purple red, a color much appreciated by all the ancient nobility. But the value of the Tyrian purple was much more than the beautiful color. This dye did not fade from the garments with the passage of time. Instead, it became stronger and livelier. Another valuable source of income for the Phoenicians was high-quality wine. The Egyptians, for instance, could not grow grapes due to their hot climate. They paid in gold for the Phoenician wine jugs. The Phoenicians still traded in silver, copper, tin, and bronze, while also producing jewelry and sculptures made of colored glass. With so many different products in the markets, the Phoenicians accumulated a truly amazing wealth. All this was possible thanks to the incredible boats developed by the Phoenicians. The Phoenician galleys were called biremes, as they had 2 rows of oars. Other models with 3 rows were called triremes. This was the best type of ancient vessel. Its style was copied by the Greeks, Egyptians, and then by the Romans. The Phoenicians had a polytheistic religion. They worshipped a great number of gods and holy deities. Albeit having a sea-orientated culture, the Phoenicians did not seem to have sea deities. The Phoenicians also conducted animal sacrifices during religious festivals. This was very common at the time in practically all religions. However, the Phoenicians also sacrificed human beings, including children and newborns. Like the Minoans of the island of Crete, the Phoenicians had this duality. They were developed, but with an odd connection to primitive customs. The Phoenicians managed to travel awe-striking distances in the sea for their time. They sailed all along the coast of Africa, reaching the Iberian Peninsula, where today Spain and Portugal are located. It is believed that the Phoenicians also reached Great Britain and traded with the Celtic tribes there. 65 years before Rome was founded, the Phoenicians founded the Carthage in North Africa, a city that one day managed to terrorize Rome. There was a theory that the Phoenicians also crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the Brazilian Northeast. But this theory has already been cast aside and is considered an exaggerated fantasy. The Phoenicians are also often quoted in the Bible. The most famous is perhaps Princess Jezebel, daughter of King Ithabal of the city of Sidon. Jezebel became famous for marrying King Ahab of Israel, exerting much influence as queen and priestess. Even with all their fame and wealth, the Phoenicians did not have a unified military force. They could not offer much resistance against the attacks of the emerging Persian Empire. In 539 BC, Persia was ruled by King Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, who conquered Phoenicia without much difficulty. Although the Phoenician cities were kept, many people moved to cities further away from Persian rule. Carthage was one of the main shelters. Its population grew substantially. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Phoenician city of Tyre, at the time under Persian rule. Alexander was cruel, ordering the death of 2,000 citizens, among them Persians and Phoenicians. Shortly after, Phoenician culture disappeared from its country of origin. The ancient region of Phoenicia was then dominated by other powers such as the Greeks and Egyptians. Carthage continued to develop and prosper, creating its own cultural identity. Its citizens became known as Carthaginians. In essence, they maintained their Phoenician origin. The Bronze Age was responsible for several technological breakthroughs in ancient civilizations, allowing the emergence of great empires. Some of these empires became extremely rich and powerful, like the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Mycenaean empires, which dominated large territories for hundreds of years. At the time, nothing seemed capable of shaking these great military and economic powers. But, as the saying goes, history is written by the winners. Around 1259 BC, the world was experiencing a period of relative peace. The Egyptians, commanded by Pharaoh Ramses II, had signed a peace treaty with the Hittite Empire, which ended a war that lasted for many generations. Other powerful kingdoms followed similar examples, and for half a century, there were no great battles. Trade flowed between nations. The island of Crete was an outpost for many merchants, providing plenty of profit and prestige to the kingdom of Minoans. But everything would change, and the world would plunge again in a vortex of chaos and unprecedented violence. In a period that lasted about 40 to 50 years, the climate of the Earth suffered sudden changes. Although we do not have exact information, historians believe that there were several successive natural disasters, such as earthquakes, tidal waves, and volcanic eruptions. The Aegean islands suffered a great impact, with earthquakes and even tsunamis. Crete, once home to the legendary Minoan kingdom, was probably the most affected by this great cataclysm. Its cities were devastated by earthquakes and reduced to rubble. Climate changes also caused periods of drought in Egypt, Israel, Phoenicia, and part of Anatolia. All these natural disasters disrupted trade routes between the empires. Many, like the kingdom of Mycenae in Greece and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, went bankrupt, generating revolts and violence among the population. But something much worse happened afterwards. Climate change and the destruction of cities forced the migration of many different peoples who were looking for new regions to conquer and establish themselves. Large groups of pirates began to attack coastal cities, devastating everything that had resisted the earthquakes. These violent and bloodthirsty pirates were nicknamed Sea Peoples, being responsible for the fall of many powers of that time. The truth is that we do not know the original place of the Sea Peoples. It is highly likely that they were a confederation of tribes who, out of necessity or opportunism, united to attack a considerable part of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. The few contemporary sources left by the Egyptians and Hittites refer to the Sea Peoples by the name of Sheridan, which may suggest that these pirates were from the islands of Sardinia and Sicily. Another hypothesis is that the Sea Peoples originate from the coastal tribes of Western Anatolia, having organized themselves as a single horde to attack the continental kingdoms. The fact is that, at the end of the Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples attacked almost all the kingdoms that could be invaded by the sea. The Minoan kingdom, which was already very weakened, was an easy target for the pirates, who killed a good part of the island's inhabitants and destroyed the remaining cities. In Anatolia, the situation was not that different. The Hittite Empire, which was already quite fragmented, was shattered, even being completely extinguished due to the sudden attacks on the pirates. In Greece, the Mycenaean states suffered some attacks around 1190 BC, but they managed to get back on their feet for some time, collapsing definitively when they were invaded by the Dorians, a warrior people who dominated a substantial part of Greece. Egypt was one of the few empires that sustained the attacks of the Sea Peoples due to the enormous military skill of Pharaoh Ramses III, who expelled them definitively from his lands. The Assyrians were the least affected by the calamities. In a way, they were able to take advantage of the weakening of the neighboring kingdoms, further expanding their domains and beginning the Middle Assyrian Empire period. Although we know little about the Sea People, they had an enormous reputation as warriors and navigators already in antiquity. During the Battle of Kadesh, between the Egyptian and Hittite forces, the Sheridan mercenaries were hired to fight for both sides, which proves that these coastal warriors were renowned. But not all the invaders of the Sea Peoples wanted only to plunder the decaying cities. There is a theory that some groups established permanent settlements on the coast of the ancient Canaan. The new inhabitants of the region became known as Philistines, a name well known in Old Testament biblical stories. Natural disasters caused the fragmentation and decay of the Bronze Age, but the Sea Peoples were responsible for the final blow to many empires. Another reason that made it impossible for the empires to recover was their highly centralized systems of government, where direct intervention by kings and emperors was necessary to solve all territorial issues. Because of the collapse of the Bronze Age, the world entered a kind of dark age, which we know little, but it was certainly turbulent and full of violence. New kingdoms were gradually organized during the Iron Age, with new models of government and armies composed mainly of well-equipped infantry. Around 750 BC, arts and writing began to resurface among the Mediterranean peoples. It is also during this period that the history of classical Greece and Rome begins. The Bronze Age had come to an end, and with it, an era of great discoveries, powerful empires, and legendary heroes, which become part of the history of the past. But it is important to remember that, without the Bronze Age, humanity would not have developed as we know it. We must be proud of the heritage left by our ancestors. At a time when powerful kings ruled with an iron fist and wanted to expand their influence to create great empires, a newly emerging force began to gain ground in the Iranian lands. The earliest accounts of the Persians are found in Assyrian writings, where they are referred to as Parsua. The Persian tribes, along with other peoples such as the Medians and Babylonians, spent a long time under Assyrian rule. However, around 609 BC, these peoples launched a huge revolt that had such an impact that it caused the collapse of the Assyrian Empire. During this time, the semi-legendary figure of the first Persian king, called Achaemenes, emerged. Although not much is known about Achaemenes, he founded the Achaemenid line that would rule over one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Among the many Persian tribes, the Achaemenids were the most powerful, and for many years they ruled smaller tribes and conquered more territory, but they were still under the rule of the Median Empire. By 559 BC, Cyrus II, better known as Cyrus the Great, became king of Persia. His rise was troubled, however, and the precedents tell a surprising story to say the least. The Greek historian Herodotus tells that Astyages, Cyrus's grandfather, ruled Persia. One night, he had a dream in which he saw that Cyrus would become ruler of all Asia. Fearing that he would lose his authority, Astyages ordered his butler to take Cyrus, who was still a baby, to the mountains and kill him there. But the butler could not find the strength to carry out this cruel task, and handed the baby over to be raised by a shepherd. Astyages was furious when he heard this, and had the butler's son killed. When Cyrus was old enough, he returned to his country. After revealing his identity and amassing popular support, he dethroned Astyages and presented his claim to the throne, sparing his grandfather's life in the end despite everything. Cyrus the Great was an expansionist king, and under his reign the Persians conquered the capital of the Mediterranean Empire and ruled over an incredibly large territory rich in natural resources. But there was still an obstacle from the Mediterranean that threatened Cyrus's sovereignty: the Greeks. After the collapse of the Hittite Empire in the Late Bronze Age, Anatolia was settled by Greek colonies that formed the Kingdom of Lydia, which refused to be ruled by the Persians. Initially, the Greeks attacked the Persian territories believing that the Greek cavalry was superior. But, to their surprise, the Persians were quite effective with their horse and camel-mounted archers. The Persians brilliantly defeated the Greeks, and the Kingdom of Lydia was ruled by Cyrus. As early as 539 BC, Cyrus and his army besieged Babylon and captured it. The Persians were welcomed as liberators by the Babylonians, who suffered from an abusive rule by King Nabonidus. The Persians not only restored political order in Babylon, but also liberated the Jews who were captive in the city, ending the famous period of Babylonian captivity. Thus, Judea became an allied kingdom of the Persians, and its territory served as protection against the Egyptians. The Persians also developed a good relationship with the Phoenicians, who were great traders and navigators. Cyrus the Great was also known for being a generous and benevolent king. He forgave his defeated enemies, and even placed them in positions in his army or government. He was also known for respecting the religious beliefs of the peoples he conquered. Perhaps one of his most memorable acts was the abolition of slavery during his reign, an act that clashed against all the customs of his time. To reinforce his noble decision, Cyrus issued a decree that is considered the world's first human rights law. The decree states, "I will prevent slavery, and my rulers and subjects are enjoined to prohibit the exchange of men and women as slaves in their spheres of government. Such a tradition shall be eradicated throughout the world." This decree is a bit of clay in cuneiform writing, known as the Cyrus cylinder. In fact, many peoples were happier and better off under Persian rule. Cyrus ruled a variety of different cultures and societies in good harmony, a feat unprecedented in human history, earning him the title of the later Shepherd King. Cyrus died in December 530 BC. Not much is known about his death, but all signs are that he died from injuries sustained in a battle against nomadic equestrian tribes. He is buried at Pasargadae, in an incredibly modest tomb for a man who commanded such a large and wealthy empire. After his death, the Persian Empire continued to expand and, at its peak, encompassed some 8 million square miles, covering Asia, Africa, and Europe. The military superiority of the Persians was due to their natural warlike culture, in which warriors and generals were praised for their strength and bravery in battle. The Persians were known to have the best horses in the world. They bred a breed called Mycenaeans, which was famous for being large, agile horses with fiery and aggressive temperaments, perfect for the battlefield. It was said that a true Persian learned 3 things from childhood: riding, archery, and telling the truth. Telling lies, being dishonest, or observing corruption was punishable by death in some cases. Those who observed truth and honor were highly respected in society. The main strength of the Persian army was in their archers, whether on horseback or on foot. They also made good use of camels, as the size and smell of these animals frightened the horses of the enemy army. Since the Persian army spanned many different countries, the army was composed of many peoples of different cultures, including Persians, Medians, Phoenicians, Chaldeans, and even Egyptians and Greeks in the military ranks. The elite warriors were the Immortals, a force of 10,000 highly trained men who served as the royal guard. The Immortals followed the Persian model and wore colorful clothing, heavy armor, helmets, sometimes even masks, a spear with an iron tip, and a counterweight on the other end. They also carried bows and arrows. The Immortals fought in a disciplined way and never backed down from the enemy. Whenever a warrior fell in battle, he was immediately replaced by one of his fellows, giving the impression that he was returning from the dead. As a system of government, the Persians maintained many capitals, a fine method to keep control over the vast territory of the empire. Persepolis was the most luxurious and impressive city of the empire, whose edification was initiated by King Darius I. The Persepolis Terrace is more than 125,000 square meters, and the walls of the palaces are up to 20 meters high. Another impressive fact about Persepolis is that it was built by free laborers. Men and women were paid according to their role in the construction. The Persian religion was Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zarathustra and considered the first monotheistic religion in history. Zoroastrianism also includes belief in a divine paradise, a hell and its demons, belief in the coming of a Messiah and resurrection, and a final judgment in which all souls will be judged. Zoroastrianism exists to this day and is worshipped by some people living in Iran and India. In 499 BC, the Persian Empire was already unbelievably large. However, with such a huge territory, problems also increased. Especially the problems with the Greek cities in Macedonia, Thrace, and Lydia, which led to constant revolts. The Greeks were always proud of their freedom and fought with all their might to defend their city-states. The Persian king Darius I was a great king and accomplished many things for the Persian people and the nations he ruled. Darius I vowed to conquer all of Greece, but to do so, he would have to cross the Black Sea with his huge army. This would take many months and give the Greeks a chance to strengthen their defenses. To solve this problem, Darius applied an ingenious solution. The Persians assembled many ships and built a bridge that connected Anatolia with Europe at a place called the Bosphorus Strait. According to Herodotus, Darius I managed to cross about 70,000 or 80,000 Persian soldiers in this way. Despite some victories in Macedonia, Darius I had difficulties against the Greeks. He planned to retreat to Persia and return with more soldiers, but he finally died a natural death before he could achieve his dream. The one who took the throne and continued Darius's wish was his son, Xerxes I. The famous King Xerxes was the son of King Darius I with Queen Atossa, being the grandson of Cyrus the Great. In the biblical texts of the Old Testament, he is called by the name Ahasuerus, and it is known that he married Esther, who was of Jewish origin. Xerxes continued the war against the Greeks, in a period that has gone down in history as the Median Wars. Several epic battles took place, such as the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis, and the Battle of Plataea. Under Xerxes, the Persians fought against King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, supported by another 6,000 Greeks from various cities. After defeating the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes and his army managed to sack the powerful city of Athens. Enraged by the stubborn resistance of the Greeks, Xerxes ordered Athens burned to the ground, even though this violated Persian custom to protect conquered cities and their inhabitants. Much of Athens was destroyed, including the sanctuaries. The next day, after appeasing his anger, Xerxes repented and had Athens rebuilt. In response to this attack, the Greeks assembled a large fleet of ships, commanded by the Athenian general Themistocles. The Greeks destroyed the Persian ships, and Xerxes had to quickly retreat to his territories to avoid being trapped with his army in Greece. Xerxes returned to Persia, psychologically devastated at losing so many men and the chance to conquer Greece, and was finally murdered in 465 BC in a political conspiracy devised by one of his ministers. After the death of Xerxes, the Persians gave up trying to conquer Greece, which probably saved much of Europe from being swallowed up by the Persian Empire. After many years of battles and turbulent successions, all was not well in the empire. The Egyptians, who were under Persian rule, revolted, and many other kingdoms followed suit. Until 336 BC, the Persian Empire was ruled by King Darius III. However, in 334 BC, Alexander the Great left Macedonia and began his campaign, conquering many territories that had previously belonged to the Persians. After years of fighting, King Darius III was defeated by Alexander at the Battle of Issus and fled with his family to the city of Ecbatana. Alexander went to Mesopotamia and eventually captured the city of Persepolis. Although Alexander was not in favor of unnecessary destruction and violence, things became chaotic in the Persian cities taken by the Greeks. Persepolis was sacked and burned down, and the same happened in Pasargadae. The story goes that Alexander went to Pasargadae to visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great, a man Alexander began to admire because of the stories he was told. When Alexander arrived, he was confused and angry to learn that Cyrus's tomb had been desecrated and looted, probably by Persian priests. He had Cyrus's tomb rebuilt and punished the priests. The ruler of Ecbatana betrayed King Darius III and had him assassinated, which marked the end of the last of the Persian kings of the Achaemenid line. Although he was his enemy, Alexander held a grand and righteous funeral for Darius III and cruelly punished those who ordered the death of his rival. Although some works of popular culture portrayed the Persians as bloodthirsty and cruel invaders, the truth is that they were very sophisticated for their time, especially in social areas and systems of government. Many historians agree that Alexander the Great did not build an empire, but conquered one that the Persians had established centuries before his birth. Whether as skilled warriors, wise kings, or ruthless conquerors, the Persians have left a precious legacy to human history.